notice that almost any kind of processed food that you buy in the store has the word enriched stamped all over it. Now, I'm not going to belabor this. Yes, I will. As somebody who takes into account what I eat, I do a lot of label reading when I go to the store. And one of the things that I've done, especially since August onward, maybe the end of July, beginning of August onward, is I've really cut out as many processed foods as I can. I make exceptions here and there when I go to like Veggie Heavy or when I eat Thanksgiving. But even then, I was mostly making my food from scratch, so I know what goes into it. But if you're shopping in the center aisle, as most people do, and you look at those ingredients, the one ingredient that you'll notice in almost all processed food is bleached, it'll be like bleached wheat flour or white wheat flour, but always before the wheat and the flour you see the word enriched. Now what that means, in short, is when you have wheat growing in the field and you pull off the grain, what you pull off is the kernel, right, the grain, and the outer part of it is called the bran. In order to make flour, you need to remove the bran, at least white flour, you need to remove the bran, and underneath that is the germ. And the germ and the bran both have some nutrients in it, but those get removed. Underneath the bran and the germ is what's called the endosperm. The endosperm is where all of the nutrients, teenagers in the back, let me tell you, just all you have to do is say certain words and they giggle. But key thing, endosperm, right? Have all the nutrients, vitamin B, all the different things that are nutritious about that plant, because the germ itself is like the embryo of the plant, and the endosperm gives the nourishment to it so that it can grow and live its life, right? Well, that pretty much gets ground down to a powder, and because of the heat from the friction of grinding it, all of the nutrients, or at least most of the nutrients, that are in that endosperm are destroyed. And then it's sifted, and what's left of the bran and the germ are removed from it, and what you have is this white powdery stuff that is pretty much mostly 110% carbohydrates with very little vitamins or any kind of nutrients. In fact, not even any dietary fiber in it. It becomes so devoid of nutrients. The FDA has a law out that it requires that if you've removed a majority of something's nutrients, you need to put those nutrients back in. So then what they do is they take artificial sources of those nutrients and put it back into the flour, and they call it enriched. Right. The problem is those nutrients that are now in the flour aren't natural to that flour. I mean, they are to some degree, like you would find them naturally in it. But the natural nutrients have been removed, and now you put in these other nutrients that aren't natural to it, and they also don't make up the whole of the nutrients that we find in wheat in nature. They don't make up the enzymes, they don't make up all of the other things that have been removed that the FDA doesn't require you somehow try to piece back into it. So you're basically getting an incomplete product when it comes to nourishment and nutrients, but it's enriched. So, in our text tonight, Paul writes that the church has been enriched by God. And as soon as I hear the word enriched, my mind automatically goes to flour, it goes to food. That food is important. See, people say you're vegan, you must not like to eat. That's the furthest thing from the truth. I love to eat. And in fact, I've learned how to gain 20 to 30 pounds while being vegan. So, I love to eat. But my mind automatically goes to food. But Paul says that we have, as the church, been enriched by God through Jesus Christ. The fact is that we are a community with or without Christ. So people say, well, what's great about being Christian? What's Christ really do? Well, it means we're a community. Listen, the NRA is a community, right? The YMCA is a community. The Elks Lodge is a community. Heck, if you go to the Greeks, on any given night, you'll find community. Community is any time that you get people together. So community isn't unique to Christ. So we have community with Christ or without Christ. We live in community, we work in community, we raise families in community, and we support organizations within our community. But here's the point. Community has drifted away from what God wanted it to be. God created us to be in communion with one another. But that communion has become something other than what God envisioned it. In the course of world history, we can see that communities have become self-centered, community-specific, which means our community is better than your community. We see that in racism. We see that in a lot of different things. It's actually kind of fitting we had the racism talk earlier. We have failed to serve some within our community, which essentially outcasts them and makes them something outside of our community. Communities have done all of these and have all of these kinds of dynamics in them that make them other than what God has called them to be. And we see in Scripture that God has intervened throughout history in community. God gave the law, which is how to live in right relationship with God and how to live in right relationship with each other, through Moses. God held people to task through the prophets, Jesus being one of them. And God also showed what the fulfillment of the law looks like in and through the life of Jesus Christ. And I would even argue in and through the life of the prophets and the people that came before him, because they all lived according to how they believed God was calling them to live. So, how does Jesus Christ enrich us? What does Paul mean by Jesus Christ enriching us? How does Jesus Christ enrich us? How have we become so devoid of the necessary nutrients of true community? He points us to look at the other, to serve the other, to be in solidarity with the other. Do you know what it means to be in solidarity, by the way? I've been using that word, but I don't want to assume that we automatically understand what the word solidarity means. Together. So if you're in solidarity with somebody, you're standing side by side with them. It's one thing to say, Sue, I know you're struggling. I'll keep you in my prayers. So how are you doing, Hazel? It's good to that's not exactly standing in solidarity with Sue. It may be acknowledging Sue to some extent, but that's not standing in solidarity. Standing in solidarity is standing side by side. Jesus said this in Matthew 25. Blessed are you, for you, when I was hungry, gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was homeless and destitute, you gave me shelter. When I was sick and in prison, you visited me. And they will turn to me and say, Lord, when did we see you naked or hungry or destitute or homeless or sick or in prison and do those things to you? And I tell you, when you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. That's what solidarity means. We have failed to stand in solidarity with God's people. And when I say God's people, I don't mean necessarily people in a building called the church. I mean all of God's people. And what on this earth is not God's? We all are God's. So God has intervened throughout history, and God has pointed us to stand in solidarity with the other and to embrace the other as one of us. And God has continually stopped the isolation that we continue to bring about when we isolate ourselves from other people. When we say that they are different than us, and we set the us-them mentality, that's really driving a wall of isolation between the two groups of people and turning them into two groups of people rather than us all being one. We've indeed been enriched, which is why we are not just a community in the Christian church, but we are a Christian community. We're not just a community, but a Christian community. Jesus has made the difference in the church. Jesus is the difference in the church. It's not that we are a community. Those exist elsewhere as well. But that Jesus is in the midst of our community. But even that term can isolate us, can it not? When we start to say, well, we're a Christian community, so we don't take the likes of you in here because you're not Christian. Or you're not the kind of Christian we think you should be. Then we divide each other that way as well. God is calling us to find ways of stopping the isolation. God is calling us to stop removing the nutrients and to begin expanding what we call community. So the idea isn't to narrow our community down, but to forever and continually expand it. So that one day we can look back and say, truly through Jesus Christ, the world has been blessed, just as God promised Abraham all of those thousands of years ago, that through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Right now, when we look at the course of human history and religion, we can't say that all of the peoples of the world have been blessed through Abraham. Some have been, some have not been. God is continually working in us to be a people who expand our boundaries, not shrink them. A people that reach out, not pull back. The more we pull back, the more deficient of God's nutrients we become. But the more we allow Christ to enrich us, the more we reach out and be the hands and feet of Christ, the more our lives look like Christ's life, the more we become a true community. Are we up to the task to expand the partnership of the Son? The partnership with the Son. I like to use the word fellowship because it reminds me of Lord of the Rings, right? The fellowship of the ring, the fellowship of the Son. Are we up to the task of expanding that partnership to further enrich our communities, just as Christ has enriched us? I can't answer that question, but I suspect we are.